the 18th of February, 1964. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m., cutting through the silence of Bumpy Johnson's Harlem apartment like a blade through flesh. The voice on the other end was tense, urgent, barely controlled. "They're going to kill him, Bumpy, tonight." Bumpy sat up in bed, instantly alert. At 57 years old, he'd survived long enough to know that 3 a.m. phone calls meant life or death. Who is calling? "This is James. James 67X. I work security for Brother Malcolm. I can't talk long, but there is a contract out. 5 men, professional killers. They're moving tonight. Malcolm X, the most dangerous black man in America, according to the FBI. The most important black voice of the generation, according to his followers, and according to Bumpy Johnson, a man worth saving. What happened over the next 72 hours would save Malcolm X's life, destroy a federal assassination plot, and put Bumpy Johnson in the crosshairs of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world. This is the story of how the King of Harlem went to war with J. Edgar Hoover and won. But first, you need to understand why Bumpy Johnson would risk everything to save a man he'd only met twice. Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson existed in different worlds, within the same neighborhood. Malcolm represented the spiritual revolution, the intellectual awakening of black consciousness. Bumpy represented the practical revolution, the economic independence that came from controlling your own territory. They'd first met in 1961 at a barbershop on 125th Street. Malcolm was there getting a haircut before a speaking engagement. Bumpy was there conducting his weekly meeting with local business owners, ensuring their protection payments were current and their concerns were addressed. "Mr. Johnson," Malcolm had said, extending his hand. "I've heard a lot about you." "All bad, I hope," Bumpy had replied with a slight smile. "Keeps people respectful." They'd talked for 20 minutes about Harlem, about power, about the responsibility that came with influence over people's lives. Malcolm spoke about awakening minds. Bumpy spoke about protecting bodies. Both men understood they were fighting the same war from different angles. Their second meeting had been more substantial. December 1963, just 3 months after the March on Washington, Malcolm had requested a private audience with Bumpy. The meeting took place in the back room of Small's Paradise, away from FBI surveillance microphones. "The government wants me dead," Malcolm had said without preamble. "They see me as a threat to the civil rights movement they can control." "And you want my protection?" Bumpy had asked. "I want your advice. You've survived 30 years in a business where most men don't last 30 months. How do you stay alive when powerful people want you dead?" Bumpy had studied Malcolm carefully. This wasn't the firebrand preacher the newspapers wrote about. This was a thoughtful, strategic mind wrapped in revolutionary rhetoric. You stay alive by making yourself more valuable alive than dead. And you stay alive by knowing who your real enemies are. That conversation had lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, Bumpy had gained respect for Malcolm's intelligence and courage. Malcolm had gained insight into survival strategies that would serve him well in the coming year. But in February 1964, those strategies weren't enough. The assassination plot against Malcolm X had originated in the highest levels of the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover had designated Malcolm as a priority target under COINTELPRO, the Bureau's secret program to disrupt and destroy black leadership. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Make it look like an internal power struggle within the Nation of Islam. Use Malcolm's break with Elijah Muhammad as cover for a professional hit. Eliminate the threat while maintaining plausible deniability. 5 men had been recruited for the job, not FBI agents, but contract killers with no direct connection to the Bureau. The payment was $50,000, channeled through intermediary accounts that couldn't be traced back to federal sources. The intelligence about the plot had come from James 67X, Malcolm's chief security officer, who'd infiltrated the planning meetings and discovered the scope of the operation. Now, at 3:47 a.m. on the 18th of February, that intelligence was being passed to the one man in Harlem who had the resources and connections to do something about it. Bumpy Johnson got dressed and made 3 phone calls. The first call was to Willie Fish's Jackson, his most trusted lieutenant. "Fish, I need you to round up the boys. We've got work to do tonight." The second call was to Detective Ray Murphy of the NYPD, a man who'd been on Bumpy's payroll for 15 years. Murphy, I need you to run some license plates for me. Federal vehicles, probably FBI. I'll have the numbers for you in an hour. The third call was to Malcolm X himself. Brother Malcolm, this is Bumpy Johnson. We need to talk right now. At 4:30 a.m., Bumpy Johnson walked into the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights, where Malcolm X was staying under heavy security. The building was supposed to be secret, known only to Malcolm's inner circle. Bumpy had found it in 20 minutes. Mr. Johnson, Malcolm said, standing as Bumpy entered the makeshift office, this is unexpected. Unexpected times call for unexpected alliances, Bumpy replied. You've got 5 professional killers coming for you tonight. FBI contract made to look like Nation of Islam retaliation. Malcolm's face went grave. How do you know this? Because I know things? It is how I stay alive. The question is, do you want to stay alive? For the next 2 hours, Bumpy outlined the assassination plot in detail. The timing, the location, the method, the cover story. Malcolm listened without interruption, his analytical mind processing the information, calculating probabilities, assessing options. Why are you helping me? Malcolm finally asked. Because you are fighting for the same thing I've been fighting for my whole life. The right of black people to control their own destiny. You do it with words. I do it with actions. But we're on the same side. Bumpy's plan was characteristically simple and devastating. Instead of trying to stop the assassination, they would let it proceed, but ensure it failed spectacularly and publicly. We're going to turn this into a trap, Bumpy explained. Let them come for you, but be ready for them. When they attack and fail, the FBI's involvement becomes a liability they can't afford. The trap was set for the 19th of February, 1964. At the scheduled location where Malcolm was supposed to be speaking, a community center in the Bronx, but Malcolm wasn't there. Instead, waiting in the community center were 20 of Bumpy's most experienced soldiers, along with 3 newspaper reporters who'd been tipped off about a major story developing in the Bronx. The 5 contract killers arrived at 7:15 p.m., expecting to find Malcolm X and a crowd of supporters. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by armed men who'd been waiting for them. The firefight lasted 3 minutes. When it was over, 2 of the killers were dead, 2 were wounded and captured, and 1 had escaped. More importantly, the FBI's connection to the plot had been exposed. Detective Murphy, working on Bumpy's intelligence, had traced the killers' vehicles back to a federal motor pool. The surviving assassins faced with murder charges began talking about their federal contacts. The newspaper reporters had documented everything, creating a scandal that reached the highest levels of government. J. Edgar Hoover was furious. 3 days after the failed assassination, Hoover called an emergency meeting of the FBI's top organized crime specialists. The subject, Bumpy Johnson. This man has just cost us one of our most important operations, Hoover said, his voice cold with rage. He has interfered with federal law enforcement, harbored a fugitive, and compromised national security. What are your orders, Director? Asked Assistant Director Clyde Tolson. Destroy him. I want Bumpy Johnson eliminated as a factor in Harlem. Use every resource we have. Surveillance, infiltration, prosecution, whatever it takes, make him disappear. The FBI's war against Bumpy Johnson began immediately. Federal agents flooded Harlem, conducting raids on his businesses, arresting his associates, pressuring his political contacts. They bugged his phones, followed his cars, photographed everyone who entered his establishments. But Bumpy had been playing this game longer than most of the federal agents had been alive. Within a week, Bumpy had identified every FBI agent operating in Harlem. He knew their names, their backgrounds, their personal weaknesses. He knew which ones had gambling problems, which ones were having affairs, which ones could be bought. More importantly, he knew something that J. Edgar Hoover didn't want anyone to know. Bumpy had been collecting information on federal officials for 30 years. Not as blackmail, but as insurance. And in his files was information about J. Edgar Hoover's personal life that would destroy the FBI director if it ever became public. On the 1st of March, 1964, Hoover received a package at his home. Inside was a single photograph and a note. The photograph showed Hoover in a compromising situation that would have ended his career and possibly landed him in prison if published. The note was simple: "Stop the harassment, or this goes to every newspaper in America." The FBI's campaign against Bumpy Johnson ended the next day. But Hoover's hatred didn't end. It evolved. If the FBI couldn't destroy Bumpy directly, they would destroy him indirectly. Through Malcolm X, the Bureau shifted strategies. Instead of trying to kill Malcolm X and blame it on the Nation of Islam, they would let the Nation of Islam kill Malcolm X while ensuring Bumpy couldn't protect him. The new plan was subtle, patient, devastating. Create a situation where Malcolm would be isolated from all potential allies, including Bumpy Johnson. Make the assassination look completely internal to the black community, with no federal fingerprints anywhere near the crime. Malcolm X was killed on the 21st of February, 1965, at the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights. 3 members of the Nation of Islam were eventually convicted of the murder. Bumpy Johnson was in police custody that day, arrested on trumped-up charges that would be dismissed 48 hours later. The timing wasn't coincidental, but even from his jail cell, Bumpy understood what had happened. The FBI had learned from their failed 1964 operation. They'd played a longer game, been more patient, covered their tracks better. They'd succeeded in killing Malcolm X, but they'd failed to destroy Bumpy Johnson. At Malcolm's funeral, Bumpy stood in the back of the church, paying his respects to a man who'd fought the same fight from a different angle as the service ended. A young reporter approached him. "Mr. Johnson, did you know Malcolm X personally?" Bumpy looked at the reporter for a long moment. "I knew him well enough to know that his death wasn't what it seemed to be." "What do you mean?" "I mean that powerful people wanted him dead, and they got what they wanted. But they didn't get everything they wanted." The reporter pressed for more details, but Bumpy walked away. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, even in a church, for the next 3 years. Until his own death in 1968, Bumpy Johnson carried the knowledge of what had really happened to Malcolm X. The FBI's involvement, the failed 1964 plot, the successful 1965 operation. He never spoke about it publicly, but he never forgot it either. In his final months, Bumpy would sometimes sit in his office at Small's Paradise, looking at a photograph of Malcolm X that he kept in his desk drawer. Friends noticed he seemed sadder, more reflective, weighted down by memories and regrets. "You think about the ones you couldn't save," Bumpy told his Lieutenant Fish Jackson one evening. "The good ones who deserved better than what they got." When Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack on the 7th of July, 1968, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally reviewed the report. The man who'd saved Malcolm X's life once and been powerless to save it a second time was finally gone. But the story of their alliance lived on in whispered conversations in Harlem barbershops and pool halls. A reminder that even in the darkest times, even when facing the most powerful enemies, there were still men willing to risk everything to protect what was right. Malcolm X had dreamed of a revolution of the mind. Bumpy Johnson had built a revolution of the streets. Together, for one brief, shining moment, they'd shown what was possible when different kinds of power worked toward the same goal. The FBI had won the war, but they'd never forgotten the battle where the King of Harlem made them look like amateurs.